Welcome back for another wonderful discussion we're going to have about the book of Moses. We're in Moses chapter 2 today. So a couple things about this chapter. This is a commonly repeated chapter because it's about the creation period. So Genesis has this as well. You can watch our videos on Genesis. Abraham has this as well. If you go watch the videos we have on Abraham. So there's lots of this creation information. And this is really important, though. This is a really, really important thing to understand. I believe it was Dallin H. Oaks said in a conference talk, I think it was in the late 90s, possibly 96 or 97. I'd have to go look up the reference to make sure. But anyways, he gave a talk. It was part of a conference talk, and he said that in order to understand the gospel of Jesus Christ, it is important for us to understand the key component of the gospel, and that is the atonement of Jesus Christ. And in order to fully understand the atonement of Jesus Christ, we need to understand what gave meaning to that atonement, which is the fall. And in order to understand the fall, we need to make sure that we understand what came before the fall, which is the creation. And so that's why it's important that we understand the creation. So this is super, super important. And I believe there's a big part of this that's important too, because when we start to understand the plan of salvation from you kind of take a step back from it, you see it from a grander perspective, rather from the spot that we're at in it, but you kind of see the whole plan. It helps to give you context and framework to understand what the purpose of this life is and what's coming next and how it all fits. Basically, it helps us to really make sure we have the proper perspective in our life. So understanding the creation is a very, very important thing. And this is something that has been talked about, really ad nauseum in ancient documents. The whole point of understanding the creation, understanding how things came together, has really, even according to Hugh, has spawned science, trying to understand the creation and God's works better. Music and plays came from understanding the creation. Some of the oldest documents in the world talk about a creation hymn. There was a song that used to be sung thousands and thousands of years ago about the creation and the creative periods. There were plays that enacted the creative periods. The whole reason things like Stonehenge and the solstice, the seasons and the festivals and things around there are all about understanding the creation and getting back to that primordial opportunity of life. So this is a really important thing that we want to make sure that we understand. And I believe part of that's why it's so iterated all the time in different places, to help us understand it better. And of course, this is a very important part of temple ceremony as well. So we're not necessarily going to read the whole chapter of chapter 2, but there's a few things that are important to understand here. So in verse 1, there's something I want to point out. He says, "It came to pass, the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Behold, I reveal unto you concerning this heaven and this earth. Write the words which I speak. I am the beginning and the end, the Almighty God, my only begotten. By my only begotten I created these things. In the beginning I created the heaven and the earth upon which thou standest." So here's the thing that's really important, is there's putting a perspective. I am revealing unto you concerning this heaven and this earth. That's it. Okay, if you remember from chapter 1, Moses was like, oh my gosh, I want to see all of it. And God said, nah, that's not for you to see. You're to understand things as it relates to your world. But that's it. You can't see the rest of the creations. And he said, oh, okay, I'm cool then. So again, they're putting a perspective. And Abraham had a similar experience. When you watch the videos on the book of Abraham, that it was Abraham gives a little bit different perspective on this. In understanding it with the kol kal beam, the Hebrew words for stars and expanse and things like that, realize that he's talking about, when he talks about kolob, he's talking about an entity of some type, an intelligence, a planet, an entity of some type that is near to the throne of God. It's near to where God is, but its governing of time and everything else dictates everything in our universe. And if you've studied the laws of physics and realize that time is a function of gravity. So when you're looking at these things, realize, and whenever they talk about a frame of time, they're really also giving you an understanding of a reference of gravitational effects. So in a way, Kolob is where all of our elements, all of our laws of physics emanate from. It powers everything in our world, sets the timing, sets the gravitational forces, sets everything up so that our world can exist. And there's a partition between our world and other worlds that are out there. So there's other universes and other things that is very possible that God has that he hasn't shown us. Those are other things that we haven't seen yet because he's just kept us focused on our world. And let's face it, that's enough to think about is how our world works, let alone how everybody else's works. So this is an important concept. And again, he's keeping Moses focused on your world. We're not talking about all the other creations and the other heavens and other stuff, just your universe, basically. So that's an important thing. And it's kind of fun to compare all these together, and maybe we should do a video where we compare all the different interpretations of creation together. But he talks about some interesting ideas, like verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and I caused darkness to come upon the face of the deep. My spirit moved upon the face of the water, for I am God. And I, God, said, let there be light, and there was light. And I, God, saw the light was good, divided the light from the darkness. So in verse 5, he says, and I, God, called the light day, and the darkness I called night. And this I did by the word of my power, and it was done as I spake. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So this is an important point in here. Moses brings up this concept of days. And this is not uncommon to what we find in the book of Genesis as well. And some people say, well, but the book of Moses tells us that a day to God is 1,000 years to man. So if he's talking about it took him one day to create all the light, it took God 1,000 years to create all the light. That, I believe, is the incorrect way to understand this. Just because we get a reckoning of time for one thing doesn't mean it holds the same for everything else. And the reason is that Moses isn't so much telling us, just like if you look in the book of Abraham, it corroborates this. Moses isn't so much telling us that it took a day, basically a day to God or 1,000 years to us, to create the light and the dark, to separate all that out. That's not what he's saying, okay? Because if you look, he says, I called the light day and the darkness I called night. But when he references the period of time that creation happened, the evening and the morning were the first day. So he used a whole different terminology to talk about the period of effort when the creation actually happened. And this is an important point because what I believe Moses is doing in here is telling us that the concept of a day, he started his work and then he did his work and then he ended his work. Okay? He's saying this is the period of time that these events were done in the creation period. And then there's another period of time where other things were done in the creation period. So the creation period is this larger period of time, and then it's broken down into 7 sections. How long each of those sections are, we don't fully know, okay? And in the book of Abraham, he gives this little bit of a tidbit to us. I believe it's chapter 4 of Abraham. It could be chapter 3, but I think it's chapter 4 when he talks about the creative periods. In Abraham, he doesn't talk about them as days. He talks them out as the beginning and the end of this period. Here's what happened. So we don't know exactly the timing of that period. That period could take longer than other periods. We don't know. In Abraham, he gives another tidbit in there where he says that we watched the elements until they obeyed. So there was a time where they would put things in motion and they would pay attention to them and work with them until they obeyed. How long that took, we don't know. Literally, it could be hundreds of millions of years that each one of these creative periods occurred in, as far as our reference to time. Okay, you got to realize time is a relative perspective. That is a very important thing to understand. Time is a relative perspective. So 100 million years to us, that could have been what it took to do the light and the dark. We don't know. It could have been 1,000 years. It could have been 3 billion years. We don't know. And really, that's not necessarily relevant, honestly, to the teachings that God wants to give us. Just understanding the creative periods, okay? So that's a very important point to bring up. So as you read through this, realize that that is what's going on. Is he's not saying that this is a day. It's a day, and that reference of 1,000 years to man is a day to God. It took 1,000 years. The creative period was 6,000 years long. That's not completely accurate. So we can't use that all the way, okay? Just like when Moses talks about Adam and Eve, he keeps using the term eastward. We're going to plant a place eastward in Eden. So they're in heaven, and they're going east from heaven to plant the Garden of Eden, and then Adam and Eve are kicked out eastward from the Garden of Eden into the world. Okay, he's not signifying that if we look west from Earth, point our telescopes west, we'll find heaven. Basically, he's saying they're moving in this direction, and they continue to move in a direction that is going away from God. So it's more metaphorical or allegorical rather than literal on some of these things. So that's one of the challenges you have, especially in the Old Testament, is what's metaphorical, what's literal. And thankfully we have several versions of these stories to help us to understand where the literal comes in and the metaphorical comes in. Some aren't as easy to understand, but we do our best. So this chapter goes into basically all the creative periods. There was a process of things that went through. And in a way, you could say that each period of creation was a dispensation. So the heavens were created. The earth was formed and created. Then there was light and dark that was created. So we have a sun, we have darkness, and you could even look at, dark matter, dark energy, or other things like that, some other ways that could be interpreted there. But then we get into, now we have an earth, and now we put in the water. Okay, so there's moisture. We put moisture in there, so we have clouds. We have an environment where there's oxygen-rich areas where life can dwell. Then we have plants and animals and fish. Then humans come last, of course, and so there's this evolution. So you could say if each period was, let's say, 100 million years, this is like a dispensation of each of these things coming in to place. Now, the creation period doesn't go into and I created dinosaurs and I created everything else. So there's really potentially a lot more that occurred either during these creative periods or after these creative periods that we don't have privy to at this time. And dinosaurs is one of those. They're not mentioned in any of these discussions about creation. Could they have been put in place around the time of the creation of animals? And maybe there were some dispensations inside that creative period that said animals grew up and then these animals died. And then we put new animals on, and then they grew up for a while, and then they died. Because if you look at it, not all the dinosaurs lived at the same time. Some dinosaurs lived early, some dinosaurs lived later. That was one of the arguments around the movie Jurassic Park, because the T-Rex and the Velociraptors lived at two completely different periods of time. They didn't exist on the Earth at the same time. And other dinosaurs were like that as well. So they lived, and then they died, and then new plants and animals lived, and then they died. New plants and animals lived, and then they died. As they go through these creative periods. So that could all be just inside that one creative period, which could be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of years of our human time inside that creative period as it happened. So that is a possibility. And then Adam and Eve is on there. Now, here's something that's fascinating about the creative periods. This is an important concept to think about, because when we look at the creation periods, and we see them in this chapter all over, okay, and like verse 22, and I, God, bless them, saying, be fruitful, multiply, fill the waters in the sea, the fowl multiply the earth, getting all the creative, the animals out there, let them to procreate, to further their species forward, and getting the cycles of life and everything else moving forward. We know that there are lots of evidence of other animals, like dinosaurs, like ancient plants that lived hundreds of millions of years ago and then got wiped out. And then a whole new group of plants came in after them. There are skulls and bones of animals or beings that look like humans or were similar to humans, but maybe a little different. There's evidence that these bones exist. You can go to museums, you can see them, they're out there. So a lot of this is where the ideas of evolution came from. Darwin didn't come up with the theory of evolution, but he really put it on the map as far as putting information out there for people to study and understand about it. But he's not the creator of it. It'd been around for a lot longer than him. But the theory of evolution says that, how to explain all these different variations of skulls and animals and things, that animals evolve over time. So over millions of years, they learn to adapt, they adjust to their environment, the genetics changes, that in course gets transferred to the next generation. The next generation is slightly different, and it continues to evolve and improve, the survival of the fittest type idea, which has been pretty refuted and pushed out of the theory of evolution for the most part, because it doesn't completely hold true. But there's this idea that things evolve. We were at one point, single cell animals, amoebas type things in the ocean, and then we later grew into multi-cell organisms, and then fish and lizards and stuff, and then became primates, monkeys and other things, and then apes and stuff, and then became humans and things like that. There's all of this evidence showing these different things that are out there, and the theory of evolution is trying to draw a line between all of them to make sense of it all. And not necessarily a bad theory. I think in a micro sense, evolution has some good overarching principles that things do change over time. Not necessarily that things get better over time, but they do change. So one thing that's interesting for us to understand as we look at this is that there can be, in these creative periods, a difference of human-like animals and children of God. Now, that might be a pretty revolutionary idea, but take a moment to think about that. There could be animals, maybe during some of those periods of creation, there were animals that walked on two legs, that moved more like humans, even more human-like than apes and other things, that lived. That could be maybe even a possibility. That could be where the caveman ideas, the Cro-Magnon man and things like that came from, where they were these human-looking animals, but they had animal spirits in them, basically. They hadn't been given the children of God spirits in them. So a different type of intelligence, if you think of it from the pre-existence. And I think that's a very possible idea to consider, that has happened. And it wasn't until it was time for the children of God to come on this earth that we get to the sixth creative period, if I remember right. And let's see, where is that? Verse 26, and God said to my only begotten, which was with me from the beginning, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and it was so. And God said, let them have dominion over the fishes of the sea, the fowl of the air, have dominion over everything on the earth. And God created man in my own image, in the image of my only begotten created I him, male and female created I them. And I blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and to do that. And all of this was, and the evening and the morning, verse 31, evening and morning were the sixth day when he put man on the earth. So all of the plants and animals, the ecosystems were put in place long before man was put on. And that doesn't mean that man was the beginning of caveman and human life and everything else. There could have been human-like animals or human-like intelligences that existed before, but then they were wiped out to make way for the spirits of the children of God to come to the earth. So something to think about. Hugh Nibley really espouses an idea called the dispensations theory of creation or evolution, realizing that it's not a smooth line going between all of these bones to show a smooth line. This turned into this turned into this turned into this. These are all related. What Hugh Nibley says is there was life, and it was here, and it was moving along, and then it got destroyed, and then suddenly there's more life that reappears in its place and moves along, and then it gets destroyed, and then suddenly there's more life, and it appears and then moves along. So more of like a dispensation of creation, basically. And the creative periods, in a way, show that. And there could be more smaller iterations inside those creative periods where the dinosaurs lived, or where other plants lived and other things lived, and that was building up and preparing the earth so that when man gets here, we have fossil fuels and other things to use as well. So there could be some possibilities in there. Now in verse 28, I do have a quote. This is from Hugh Nibley, The Eloquent Witness by Hugh Nibley, volume 17 of his collected works. He says this is seen, talking about when God gives this idea of be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth and have dominion over everything. He says this is seen throughout the ancient literature to be a charge of grave responsibility for Adam to supervise the increase and prosperity of all creatures. Quote, though many Latter-day Saints have treated it as a license to exterminate. That's Hugh opinion in there. When the time comes to restore that blessed state of the earth, which the gospel anticipates, then, quote, Zion must increase in beauty and in holiness. Zion must arise and put on her beautiful garments. D&C 82:14. So what he's talking about here is that, Adam and Eve, as the beginning of the spirits of children of God on the earth, were given dominion over everything else, basically. And of course, we know that's through the priesthood authority that happens. As we exercise the priesthood appropriately, then the animals will respond appropriately to us as we do that. So it is a responsibility, though. We have been given a responsibility to take care of the earth and to get it prepared to be the beautiful Zion it once was, to restore that back and have that to come back. So that's obviously going to mean a lot of changes in how we do things on this earth to help beautify it, to be more responsible with how we use the resources on this earth. I'm not saying that it advocates for climate change stuff, because I think there's still a lot of philosophies of men inside the climate change arguments that are out there. But I think there is still some truth and some valid opportunities for us to look at. And Native Americans had a tremendous amount of ideas and good things that can help in understanding how to be good stewards of this planet. So some fun stuff that we get to learn in Moses chapter 2. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Stick around for Moses chapter 3 coming up, as well as the book of Abraham and everything else also. So watch our other videos. Comment what you think about these creative periods and how they work, and your thoughts and ideas on them. And realize, again, this is Moses going through an endowment ceremony. He is learning the things he needs to know to help him. It's the same as the endowment ceremony in the temple. So a lot of fun stuff for us to learn. Thanks.